This story is titled, Mother-in-Law Moved in Temporarily After Her House Flooded and Slowly Took Over My Home. When I finally stood up to her, my husband chose her side and asked for divorce. As I sit here in my empty living room, surrounded by half-packed boxes and fading memories, I can't help but laugh at the bitter irony of my situation. 6 months ago, I had a beautiful home, a seemingly perfect marriage of 8 years, and what I thought was a normal relationship with my mother-in-law. Now, I'm facing divorce papers because I dared to stand up against the woman who systematically destroyed my life under the guise of temporary accommodation. Looking back, I should have seen the red flags, but who could have predicted that a natural disaster would lead to the complete demolition of my marriage? I'm Jessica, 34F, and this is how my mother-in-law Linda, 58F, managed to turn my husband Marcus, 36M, against me in just 6 months. Before this nightmare began, Marcus and I had built what I considered a dream life. We'd purchased our 3-bedroom craftsman-style house in suburban Michigan 4 years ago, transformed it into our perfect home, and were finally starting to discuss having children. I worked as a high school art teacher, while Marcus had a successful career as an architect. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable, happy, and most importantly, we had our own space. Our marriage wasn't perfect, whose is? But we dealt with our issues like adults. The only recurring source of tension was Marcus's relationship with his mother, Linda. She'd been widowed 5 years ago, when Marcus's father passed away from a heart attack, and since then, she'd grown increasingly dependent on her only child. Weekly dinner visits turned into twice weekly, then 3 times. Phone calls became more frequent and longer. Still, I tried to be understanding. Grief affects people differently, right? Linda lived about an hour away in a small town near Lake Michigan, in the house where Marcus grew up. She'd always made little comments about how I kept our home, how I cooked, never quite as good as her recipes, and how I was taking Marcus away from his family. I learned to bite my tongue and smile, maintaining peace for Marcus's sake. After all, she only visited occasionally, and I could handle a few hours of passive-aggressive comments here and there. Then came the storm. That fateful night in September, unprecedented rainfall caused severe flooding in Linda's area. Her basement was completely submerged, and water damage had compromised the house's foundation. When Marcus got the panic call at 2 a.m., we both knew we had to help. What I didn't know was that this crisis would become the catalyst for the systematic dismantling of my marriage. Looking at these walls now, I can pinpoint the exact moment everything started to change. It was when Marcus uttered those seemingly innocent words. "Mom needs a place to stay temporarily while her house gets repaired. It'll just be for a few weeks tops." If only I knew then what I know now. If only I could go back and tell myself that temporary would become the longest 6 months of my life. But hindsight is 20/20th, isn't it? And as I sit here, wondering how my life imploded so spectacularly, I can't help but think about Marcus's sister Amy, 38F, who lives just 30 minutes from Linda's house. Funny how she was suddenly too busy to take in her own mother, isn't it? Now I understand why she looked at me with such pity when I agreed to let Linda stay with us. The first week wasn't too bad. Linda was grateful, helpful even. But like a slowly tightening noose, things began to change. And as I pack up my belongings, I can't help but wonder, at what point did my home stop being mine? Was it when Linda rearranged my kitchen without asking? When she started criticizing my wasteful grocery shopping? Or was it when she began turning Marcus against me, one subtle manipulation at a time? The change was so gradual that at first, I doubted my own sanity. Looking back now, I can see how Linda masterfully executed her takeover of our home, using tactics so subtle that any complaints from me would make me sound paranoid or petty. But let me tell you how it all unfolded, and you can judge for yourself if I'm the unreasonable one here. It started with the kitchen. Our beautiful, modern kitchen that I had spent weekends painting and decorating with Marcus. One day, I came home from work to find everything rearranged. The coffee maker was gone from its usual spot, replaced by Linda's ancient one that she'd brought from her house. My carefully organized spice rack had been dismantled, with Linda's own spices taking prominent positions at the front. When I asked about it, she gave me that sugar-sweet smile and said she was just trying to make the kitchen more efficient. Marcus, of course, thought it was great that his mother was helping out. Then came the comments about my cooking. Every meal I prepared was met with subtle criticism. "Oh, sweetie, that's an interesting way to make lasagna. In my family, we always," or, "Marcus always loved my pot roast because I cook it differently." She'd hover over my shoulder as I cooked, making little skiing sounds that set my teeth on edge. Eventually, I started eating lunch in my classroom to avoid the constant criticism. The real turning point came when Linda started doing our laundry without asking. I came home one day to find my expensive silk blouses and delicate sweaters had been washed on hot and dried on high heat. Half my wardrobe was ruined. When I tried to explain why I was upset, Linda burst into tears, wailing about how she was just trying to help, and how ungrateful I was after she'd done such a nice thing for us. Marcus came home to find his mother crying and me standing there, apparently the villain who had reduced his poor mother to tears. That was when I first noticed the shift in Marcus. He started defending every single thing his mother did, no matter how invasive or inappropriate. When Linda began redecorating our living room while I was at work, moving my grandmother's antique mirror to the garage because it didn't match her vision, Marcus told me I was being too protective of just stuff. When she started going through our mail and organizing our bills, which I later discovered meant her scrutinizing our spending habits and reporting everything back to Marcus, he said she was just trying to be helpful. Our intimacy suffered too. It's hard to feel romantic when your mother-in-law's bedroom is right next to yours, and she has a habit of, accidentally, walking in without knocking. Soon Marcus and I were sleeping with a foot of space between us, barely touching, barely talking. The worst part? Linda would make these innocent-sounding comments at dinner about how tired and stressed I looked, and how some wives know how to keep their husbands happy despite their busy jobs. I tried reaching out to Amy, Marcus's sister, hoping she might help me understand what was happening, or perhaps talk some sense into Linda. Her response was unexpected and chilling. She explained that this exact scenario had played out with Marcus's previous girlfriend of 3 years, Emma. Apparently, Linda had moved in with them temporarily after a supposed plumbing emergency, and within months, the relationship had completely fallen apart. Amy had tried to warn Emma, but by then it was too late. Why hadn't anyone warned me about this pattern? The renovation updates from Linda's contractor became increasingly vague. Every time Marcus asked about progress, there was some new problem discovered, some new delay, some new reason why the work was taking longer than expected. I started doing some digging and made a discovery that made my blood run cold. Linda had canceled the renovation contract 2 months ago. She had no intention of ever moving back to her house. But that wasn't even the worst part. The real shock came when I overheard Linda on the phone late one night, thinking everyone was asleep. She was talking to someone. I'm pretty sure it was her sister, and what I heard turned my whole world upside down. Not only was the flood damage to her house not as bad as she claimed, but she'd been planning this move for months. The storm had just provided her with the perfect opportunity to execute her plan. After overhearing Linda's late-night confession, I spent the next week in a daze, wondering how to proceed with this information. Should I confront her? Tell Marcus? The weight of this secret felt like it was crushing me. But before I could decide what to do, Linda made her next move, one that would change everything. It started when my best friend Rachel, 35F, came over for coffee one Saturday morning while Marcus was at the gym. Rachel had been my rock throughout this whole ordeal, the only person besides Amy who seemed to understand what was really happening. Linda, who usually spent Saturday mornings watching her cooking shows, surprisingly joined us in the kitchen. She was being unusually nice, even offering to make us her special coffee cake. As we chatted, Linda casually mentioned how worried she was about Marcus working such long hours. Then, with perfectly practiced concern in her voice, she dropped the bomb. She'd noticed I'd been spending a lot of time with my male colleague from school, David, 32M, who had helped me organize the annual art exhibition last month. The way she said it, dripping with insinuation, made my stomach turn. Rachel nearly choked on her coffee. She knew David was happily married to her cousin. But Linda wasn't done. She went on to detail every interaction I'd had with David over the past month, somehow twisting innocent work meetings into something sinister. She'd been watching me, documenting everything. the art exhibition planning meetings, the times David had helped me carry supplies to my car, even the group lunch with other teachers that she'd apparently observed from her car in the school parking lot. I felt sick realizing she'd been stalking me at work. Rachel tried to defend me, explaining that David was her cousin-in-law and that this was ridiculous. But Linda just smiled that sickeningly sweet smile and said she was just looking out for her son. After Rachel left, Linda made it clear, if I didn't start behaving more appropriately, she would be forced to share her concerns with Marcus. I was stunned. This wasn't just meddling anymore. This was blackmail. The worst part? Linda had masterfully laid the groundwork for weeks. All those times she'd mentioned to Marcus how late I was staying at school, how I seemed to be hiding my phone, how I was distant. It all made sense now. She was creating a narrative that would make her lies seem plausible. That evening, I finally broke down and called Amy. What she told me made everything so much clearer. Apparently, this was Linda's signature move. She'd done the same thing to Emma, Marcus's ex, accusing her of having an affair with her gym trainer. The accusations had destroyed their relationship, just as Linda had planned. But Amy shared something else, something that made my blood run cold. Linda had pulled the same stunt with Marcus's father before he died. According to Amy, their father had been planning to divorce Linda after discovering she'd been embezzling money from their joint accounts. Linda's response? She convinced him that his young secretary was trying to seduce him, going so far as to stage compromising situations and take photos out of context. The stress of the whole situation had contributed to his fatal heart attack. Amy had tried to tell Marcus the truth after their father's death, but he refused to believe anything negative about his mother. I sat on my back porch that night, staring at the garden I'd planted when we first moved in, now overtaken by Linda's preferred flowers. The woman sleeping in my guest room wasn't just a manipulative mother-in-law. She was dangerous. And now she had me in her crosshairs. But Linda had made one crucial mistake. She'd shown her hand too early. I might not be able to prevent her from telling her lies to Marcus, but I could prepare for it. I spent that night making copies of all my text messages with David and other colleagues, documenting every interaction, and asking Rachel to write down everything she'd witnessed. I also started secretly recording Linda's conversations with me on my phone. If she wanted to play this game, I would be ready. What I wasn't ready for, though, was what I discovered the next day when I decided to do some investigating of my own. Hidden in Linda's room, tucked away in her bedside table drawer while she was out shopping, I found a small notebook. As I flipped through its pages, my hand started shaking. There, in Linda's neat handwriting, was a detailed plan, not just for destroying my marriage, but for ensuring Marcus would never leave her again. The dates in the notebook went back months before the flood, proving this had all been premeditated. But it was the last page that truly terrified me. Linda had already started looking at 2-bedroom apartments in our city, planning for a life where it would be just her and Marcus after I was gone. After finding Linda's notebook, I felt like I was living in a psychological thriller. Every creak in the house, every whispered phone conversation, every innocent-looking smile from Linda made my skin crawl. I kept the notebook's existence to myself, taking photos of every page before returning it exactly where I'd found it. My hands wouldn't stop shaking for hours after I put it back, terrified that Linda would somehow know I discovered her master plan. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and strategic planning. I decided to confide in my sister Kate, 39F, who works as a family therapist. She suggested I start keeping a detailed log of everything happening in the house, and recommended I secure my important documents. Smart advice, as it turned out. Because when I went to check our safe, I discovered Linda had already been there. Several of my personal documents, including my passport, were slightly out of place. But Linda was moving faster than I anticipated. That Friday, she orchestrated what I now realize was her endgame. I came home from work early due to a migraine, only to find Linda crying hysterically in our living room. Marcus was already there, having been summoned by an emergency text from his mother. The moment I walked in, I knew something was terribly wrong. Linda had set her trap perfectly. She told Marcus she found evidence that I was having an affair. She'd gone through my work laptop, which I'd accidentally left open that morning, and found emails between David and me about the art exhibition. Completely innocent emails, But Linda had carefully selected and printed out parts of them out of context, making normal work conversations seem suspicious. She'd even gone so far as to fake additional messages by manipulating the email printouts. But that wasn't all. She produced photos of me and David at school events, pictures she'd taken secretly over the past months, angled in ways that made normal interactions look intimate. She had created an entire false narrative, complete with dates and times of supposed meetings that were actually just routine school activities. Marcus, the man who I had loved and trusted for 8 years, the man who had promised to always be on my side, sat there silently as his mother spun her web of lies. The worst part? I could see in his eyes that he believed her. All those little seeds of doubt she'd been planting for months had finally bloomed into full-grown suspicion. I tried to defend myself, tried to explain about the art exhibition, tried to show him the full email chains on my phone. But Linda had thought of everything. She started crying harder, claiming she'd also seen text messages that I deleted, completely fictional, of course. She said she'd been trying to protect Marcus from the truth, trying to give me a chance to end it, before she had to break her son's heart. Then came the masterstroke. Linda revealed she'd invited David's wife Ginny to come over. She'd contacted her that morning, playing the role of the concerned mother-in-law who couldn't bear to see her son being deceived. Ginny was already on her way, unaware that she was being manipulated into participating in Linda's scheme. I felt like I was drowning. Everything was happening too fast. I needed to think, needed to explain, needed time to show Marcus the evidence I'd gathered about his mother's true nature. But Linda had chosen her moment perfectly. I was caught off guard, sick with a migraine, and emotionally overwhelmed. That's when I made a crucial mistake. In my panic and desperation, I blurted out everything: the overheard phone call, the notebook I found, Linda's history with Emma and Marcus's father, everything Amy had told me. But instead of proving my innocence, my words had the opposite effect. To Marcus, I sounded exactly like what Linda had painted me to be: a desperate woman making wild accusations to cover her own guilt. Linda's performance was Oscar-worthy. She appeared shocked and hurt by my horrible lies about her, turning to Marcus with tears streaming down her face, asking him how I could say such terrible things about his poor mother, dragging up his father's memory like that. She even suggested that my erratic behavior might indicate deeper psychological issues. Just then, the doorbell rang. Ginny had arrived. As Marcus went to answer it, Linda gave me a look I'll never forget, a small, triumphant smile that chilled me to my core. In that moment, I realized that no matter what happened next, Linda had won. She had orchestrated this moment perfectly, and I was about to watch my marriage implode in front of a growing audience. But sometimes, when you think you've lost everything, life throws you an unexpected lifeline. And what happened next would change everything, just not in the way Linda had planned. When Marcus opened the door, it wasn't just Ginny standing there. Rachel was with her. My heart nearly stopped when I saw my best friend's face. She looked furious, but there was also a hint of satisfaction in her expression that I didn't understand. As they walked in, I noticed Rachel was clutching her phone tightly, and Ginny looked more confused than angry. What happened next was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion, but not in the way Linda had planned. Ginny immediately rushed to my side, much to everyone's surprise. It turned out that after Linda's call, Ginny had contacted Rachel, her cousin, to verify the story. Rachel, who had witnessed Linda's earlier threats about David, had spent the last hour filling Ginny in on everything that had been happening in our house. But Rachel had done more than just talk. Remember that Saturday morning when Linda had joined us for coffee and made her thinly veiled threats? Rachel had secretly recorded the entire conversation on her phone. She'd started doing it after I told her about Linda's increasing strange behavior, thinking it might come in handy. Now, standing in my living room, Rachel played that recording for everyone to hear. Linda's face turned ashen as her own voice filled the room, detailing her plans to accuse me of having an affair with David. The recording captured everything: her threats, her admission of stalking me at work, and most damningly, her slip-up about watching us. 4 months before the flood. Marcus stood there, frozen, as his mother's true nature was exposed in her own words. Jenny, bless her heart, had brought something else: a detailed timeline of David's whereabouts during all the times Linda claimed we were having our affair. As the director of their church's youth program, David's schedule was meticulously documented, complete with witness accounts and photographs from events. Many of the times Linda claimed we were together, David had been leading youth group activities or chaperoning teen events. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was Linda's recorded voice continuing to play from Rachel's phone, now reaching the part where she'd implied she would manufacture evidence if I didn't. Behave more appropriately. I watched Marcus's face as he listened, saw the exact moment when his carefully constructed reality began to crack. Linda tried to recover, claiming the recording was manipulated, that Rachel and I had planned this together, that Jenny was covering for her cousin-in-law. But then I did something that stopped her cold. I walked to her room, retrieved her notebook from its hiding place, and handed it to Marcus. As Marcus read through his mother's detailed plans to destroy our marriage, documented in her own handwriting, Linda's composure finally cracked. She lunged for the notebook, mask of sweet concern replaced by raw fury. In her desperate attempt to grab it, she shoved me hard enough that I stumbled backward into the coffee table, knocking over a lamp that shattered on the floor. The sound of breaking glass seemed to snap Marcus out of his stunned silence. He stepped between his mother and me, finally seeing her clearly for what felt like the first time. Linda's reaction to being exposed was a stark contrast to her usual carefully maintained image of the doting mother. She was practically feral, screaming that everything she'd done was for Marcus's own good, that I was trying to turn her son against her, that she was the only one who truly loved him. But there was one final revelation that broke everything wide open. Jenny, who had been quietly tapping on her phone while chaos erupted around her, suddenly spoke up. She'd been texting with Amy, who had finally found what she'd been searching for since I called her last week, emails between Linda and Emma's former gym trainer, proving that Linda had orchestrated the same scenario years ago. Amy had been sitting on this evidence for years, too afraid to show Marcus when he was still under their mother's influence. But now she was sending everything to Jenny's phone. As the truth cascaded down around us, I watched my husband's face cycle through emotions: shock, denial, anger, and finally, devastating realization. The mother he defended, the woman he'd chosen to believe over his wife time and time again, had been systematically destroying his relationships for years. Linda must have seen she was losing control because she played her final card. She collapsed to the floor, clutching her chest, claiming she was having a heart attack. But her performance fell flat this time. Jenny, who worked as an ER nurse, quickly assessed her and firmly stated that Linda was showing no signs of actual distress. The manipulation was so obvious now that even Marcus couldn't ignore it. What happened next would haunt me for months to come, though not for the reasons I expected. The next few hours were some of the most surreal of my life. After Linda's fake heart attack failed to gain sympathy, she switched tactics entirely. Gone was the sweet, concerned mother-in-law act. Instead, we all witnessed the emergence of someone I barely recognized. A woman so consumed by control and manipulation that she seemed to have lost touch with reality entirely. Marcus ordered Linda to leave our house immediately. Her response was chilling. She looked him straight in the eye and said he would regret choosing that woman over his own mother, just like his father had regretted choosing his secretary. Then she turned to me with a smile that made my blood run cold and said, "You think this is over? This is just the beginning." Rachel and Jenny stayed with me, while Marcus drove Linda to a nearby hotel. I spent those hours in a daze, trying to process everything that had happened. Jenny helped me document the bruise forming on my hip from where I'd hit the coffee table, insisting that I take photos and file a report about Linda's physical assault. Rachel, meanwhile, backed up her recording to multiple devices and helped me gather Linda's notebook and other evidence into a secure place. When Marcus returned, he was a different man from the one who'd left. He looked older somehow, defeated. He sat heavily on our couch, the same couch where hours earlier he'd been ready to believe his mother's lies about me, and broke down completely. Between sobs, he revealed something that made everything even more horrifying. He found prescription bottles in his mother's purse while helping her pack her hotel bag. They were psychiatric medications that had been prescribed months ago, but they were completely full. Linda had never taken them. As it turned out, after his father's death, Linda had been diagnosed with a severe personality disorder and prescribed medication. Marcus had assumed she was following her treatment plan, using it as justification for her occasionally strange behavior. The untouched pills proved she'd been manipulating everyone, including her doctors. That night, as our house finally fell quiet, I expected to feel relief. Instead, I felt a deep, crushing sadness. Not just for myself, but for Marcus, who had to face the reality that his entire relationship with his mother had been built on manipulation and lies. For Amy, who had carried the weight of knowing the truth about her mother for years. Even for Linda herself, who was so broken that she'd rather destroy her son's happiness than risk losing control over him. But when Marcus turned to me and asked if we could work through this together, if I could forgive him for doubting me, I felt something inside me break. All I could think about were the months of isolation, of being doubted and dismissed, of watching him choose his mother over me time and time again. The recording and evidence hadn't changed the fact that he'd been willing to believe the worst about me, his wife of 8 years, based on his mother's lies. I looked around our living room, now in disarray from the evening's chaos. The broken lamp, the scattered papers, the ghost of Linda's presence still lingering in every rearranged item and changed decoration. This house that had stopped feeling like my home months ago. And I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't sure I wanted to fix this anymore. My sister Kate's words from months ago came back to me. Sometimes the hardest part isn't recognizing that something is broken. It's accepting that not everything broken can be fixed. Looking at Marcus, I saw not just my husband, but a man who had allowed his mother to systematically destroy our marriage while he looked the other way. The trust between us had been broken not just by Linda's actions, but by Marcus's willing blindness to them. What I did next would shock everyone, including myself. But sitting there, watching Marcus plead for another chance, I finally understood why Amy had looked at me with such pity when I first agreed to let Linda move in. Some damage can't be undone, some trust can't be rebuilt, and some choices, once made, change everything forever. That night, I slept in our guest room, Linda's room, until a few hours ago. As I lay there, surrounded by the lingering scent of her perfume, I made the hardest decision of my life. The next morning, while Marcus was still asleep, I called my sister Kate and asked her to come over. I needed a witness, someone strong enough to support me through what I was about to do. When Kate arrived, I sat Marcus down and told him I wanted a divorce. The look of shock on his face was almost comical. He genuinely couldn't understand why exposing his mother's manipulation wasn't enough to fix everything. But as I explained to him, this wasn't just about Linda anymore. It was about us, about trust, about the fundamental ways he had failed our marriage long before his mother moved in. I told him about all the moments I needed him to be my partner, when I needed him to choose our marriage over his mother's manipulation. About how each time he dismissed my concerns, each time he defended her actions, each time he chose to believe the worst about me, he had chipped away at the foundation of our relationship. Linda hadn't destroyed our marriage alone. She'd had helped. Marcus begged for another chance. He promised therapy, both couples and individual. He swore he would cut contact with Linda, that he understood everything now. But as I looked at him, I realized something important. I didn't want to be someone's second choice who only became their first choice when all the evidence was stacked overwhelmingly in my favor. I deserved better than that. The next few days were a blur of activity. I took a week off from work, using my personal days to start untangling our lives. Amy came to help, bringing with her a surprising piece of information. She'd found Linda's old journals, dating back to before Marcus's father's death. The pattern of manipulation went back decades. Reading through them, Marcus finally began to understand the depth of his mother's illness and his own role in enabling it. Linda didn't go quietly. She started calling everyone we knew, spinning stories about how I had manipulated and turned her son against her. But Rachel's recording had already made its rounds through our social circle, and Linda's own behavior had revealed her true nature. Her carefully crafted image of the doting mother was shattered beyond repair. 3 weeks after that fateful night, I moved into my own apartment. It's small but bright, with a kitchen that no one will rearrange and a living room decorated exactly the way I want it. The walls are bare right now, waiting for me to create new memories to fill them. My grandmother's antique mirror, rescued from the garage, hangs in the entryway, a reminder that sometimes you have to break free to find yourself again. Marcus started therapy, both to deal with his mother's manipulation and to understand why he enabled it for so long. We still talk occasionally, mainly to handle divorce logistics, and I can see him struggling to come to terms with everything. Last week, he told me that Linda had shown up at his office, causing such a scene that security had to escort her out. He's finally understanding what I meant about some things being broken beyond repair. Amy visits often, our shared experience with Linda having forged a friendship that outlasted my marriage to her brother. She told me recently that she's proud of me for being strong enough to walk away. Most people, she said, spend their whole lives trying to fix what's broken instead of building something new. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if I made the right choice. Then I remember the feeling of walking into my own space for the first time, of making decisions without wondering how they would be twisted against me, of sleeping without wondering what schemes were being plotted under my own roof. I remember what it feels like to be trusted and believed without needing recordings and evidence and witnesses. Yesterday, I ran into Ginny at the grocery store. She hugged me and shared that her church's youth group had dedicated their latest project to spotting and supporting victims of manipulation and emotional abuse. Something beautiful had grown from all that pain. As I sit here in my new living room, finishing this story, I realized that what happened wasn't just about a mother-in-law who moved in temporarily, or a husband who chose wrongly. It was about recognizing your own worth and having the courage to choose yourself when no one else will. Sometimes the happy ending isn't fixing what's broken. It's letting go and starting fresh. The art teacher in me knows that some of the most beautiful creations come from blank canvases. And that's what I have now, a blank canvas, ready for whatever comes next.